So I'm experimenting with camera positions and setups and stuff like that. I don't think it's working terribly well, but we'll have to bear with it for this evening. Hopefully it won't be too bad. I thought we'd have a little discussion about the initial serialization of Graham Brady's upcoming book. So Graham Brady, for those who he knows a lot of secrets, and it seems that he's publishing a load of them about his own party. So for those who don't know, Sir Graham Brady was the chair of the 1922 committee, and he was the chair for a very long time. He was the chair, actually, I think, for the entire period that the Conservatives were in government. If he wasn't the chair from 2010, I should probably look it up. It certainly was going back to Cameron's days as Prime Minister. And the 1922 committee is actually a very good idea. It's something that maybe Labour should really adopt in many ways. It's like a union. It's weird that the Conservatives are the only political party in Parliament that actually have a union. And that's what it exists for backbenchers, to make sure that so the chair of the 1922 committee makes sure that the Prime Minister, or the leader of the party, because they're not always in government, is kept up to date with the mood of the backbenchers. Now, the whips do that to a certain extent, but the whips are sort of on the leadership side, whereas the chair of the 1922 committee is more on the backbenchers side. In fact, Carradine, thank you very much, saying Brady was chair from 2010 to 2024, a brief gap in 2019. So there we go. So he's covered all of those, and he's publishing a book. Now, I don't get political memoirs very often, but I'm getting this one. I've put it on pre-order because mostly it's because the reason I generally don't get political memoirs is they're not likely to be very truthful. They're likely to be very self-serving, and you won't necessarily get a lot from them. Now, I'm not saying the same won't be true of Graham Brady to an extent, but I think a lot of the, I've been reading one of the Daily Telegraph are going to serialize some of it. And I've been reading one article yesterday evening. And there's opinions in there that are really baffling. I think, how could you have that opinion, mate? One of his opinions is he thinks, for example, Rishi Sunak doesn't have an ego. Now, I suppose it's all relative. He may have less of an ego than some of his illustrious predecessors. But at the same time, he was very easy to wind up when you try to suggest he wasn't actually doing his best. So that sounds to me like an ego. But anyway, never mind. Brady was the Conservative version of Mick Lynch. Perhaps, yes. Actually, maybe. But it was a bit more shadowy than that, because during normal times, actually, all his job was to make sure that the leadership was kept abreast of the mood of backbenchers so they didn't make any missteps. However, because we've had such turbulent times, he has also been instrumental in giving multiple Conservative leaders the tap on the shoulder. That would include, in fact, 3 of the 5 Conservative Prime Ministers. So Theresa May, Liz Truss and Boris Johnson will all have had Graham Brady go to them and say, yeah, you're going to have to resign now. So there's only Rishi Sunak and someone got away with it. But I'm going to tell you, there's a David Cameron quote. If people have read the article, you know what I'm talking about. He says something about David Cameron towards the end of this article, which I can't possibly mention at the start of the stream, otherwise I'll get demonetized. So hopefully I'll remember to do that a bit later. But I'll tell you what confuses me. It's quite interesting to know, because it relates to why Rishi Sunak called the election when he did. Now, there's a lot of Conservatives would like to know, why did he call it then instead of autumn when it would have been better? Whereas I tend to come from the other angle. I would love to know why Conservatives thought it would be better in autumn. Like, a few weeks ago, they were all going mental when we had a month of economic data where it looked like the economy was growing a bit. And went, well, why did we wait? We've got a growing economy. Why didn't we wait a few more months? And it's like, well, first of all, no one's noticing this growth because it's tiny. In fact, let me put up what, because they're trying to say, oh, we've got the highest growth in the G7. No, we haven't. This is what it actually looks like. Where's it gone? Where's my growth chart? That is what it looks like. Because what they're doing is they're cherry picking. We've heard that phrase before. They're cherry picking a month where it suits them. But no, actually, if you're gonna say that this government, the last parliament produced the highest growth in the G7, then you go back to the start of that parliament. So this is just quarter four of 2019. So the aim of it is actually to compare the economy post-COVID with pre-COVID, but it also happens to coincide very happily with when the Conservatives won their majority at the end of 2019. This is the reality. It's better than Germany, because Germany didn't half cause itself some problems with Nord Stream. But other than that, no, we're not the best growing economy in the G7 by far. So that's the real one. So anyway, but then the most recent economic news is we haven't grown actually at all. So we're still in a slump. So it wasn't going to get better by autumn. And also, people weren't going to, like, even if you get like 0.1 or 0.2% growth, people don't notice that unless it happens every month. It needs to happen every month. You need growth of multiple percent a year for people to really notice. Unless you're going to have a major redistribution of wealth, which obviously the Conservatives are not going to do. But I will tell you what is interesting in this thing. And that is Graham Brady, because one of the reasons why people thought he might have gone earlier was, did he feel under pressure? Did he feel that he may have been facing a confidence vote imminently? And Graham Brady's saying, no, not at all. In fact, what he says now, because it all was very secret. He was never allowed to say how many letters there were at any one time. All had to be very secret. But now he's happy to sort of say what the situation was. And he says there were 10 letters. He says there were 10 letters. I think as I read it, it might be... Yeah, so he says... But it also says here, Lord... Because he's Lord now, he's gone to the House of Lords. It was Sir Graham Brady, now it's Lord Brady. Lord Brady reveals that Rishi Sunak was not forced to call an early election because only 10 letters of no confidence in him had been submitted. But here's my question to that. How would he know? How would Rishi Sunak have known that? Was he allowed to tell the leader how many letters there were? Was it just everyone else who had to be secret? Or was he basing that on the idea that if the number of letters got close to a particular, well, the number that was needed, would he like have a quiet little word with Rishi Sunak, and because he hadn't, Rishi Sunak had no reason to believe that those letters were close? Because I'm looking at this and he's saying, oh no, he wasn't forced to call it because he feared a confidence vote because there's only 10 letters. Yeah, but only you know that, mate. Was he supposed to be psychic or something? Anyway, Viv's saying, talking of shadow, you're rather in the dark tonight, Phil. Yeah, I tried an experiment. It's not working with my camera. Actually, it looks all right in certain positions, they're not others. So that's the problem, really. I'd moved my camera and lights and stuff, and it's not working. So it'll go back to where it was in future, which was not necessarily great either, but, you know, never mind. Matthew there saying, Graham Brady still a Brexiteer, supported the Brady amendment to scrap the backstop in the Brexit deal. Oh, yeah, I mean, you know, at the end of the day, he's a Conservative. We don't all have to, just because in his memoirs, statements, because there'll be statements of facts and there'll be opinions, right? Just filter out the opinions. In terms of, just because we think a lot of the statements of fact will be true, because let's be honest, he doesn't have to lie about it. If he wants to produce a sensational book about all the things that Tory MPs have got up to, particularly leaders, quite frankly, he doesn't have to make anything up. But just because he'll be writing a book that's largely honest as he understands it, you know, in terms of his own honesty, because it will contain opinions, you know, he's still a Conservative. It's like, you know, we don't have to think, oh yes, he's one of the good ones at all. In fact, one of the so he, in opposition before Cameron won in 2010, he was initially invited into, was he even in the shadow cabinet? He may not have been in the shadow cabinet, but he was a shadow minister, at least. And I seem to recall he resigned because David Cameron wouldn't back the reintroduction of new grammar schools, which is like a serial thing for Conservatives. Oh, we want the grammar schools. The public don't want them, so no. It's one of their weird things. Like, I often talk about the things that Labour have to do in order to make themselves electable, which a lot of party members and MPs don't really like. Well, the Conservatives have a few of their own, some weird ones in their case, and one of them is grammar schools. They all want grammar schools, and the public don't want grammar schools. So, you know, Cameron was like, no, we're trying to win power here. We're not going to back new grammar schools. And Graham Brady went, well, I'm off to the backbenchers then. And then he went off to become chair of the 1922. Pollinator saying, remember Brady made a visit to Downing Street a few weeks before the election. He could have hinted to something then. I mean, he could have done. Maybe that's what he's talking about. Maybe he's suggesting that although he doesn't reveal how many letters, he does, when he meets the leader, give them a rough notion of whether they should worry or not. Although even then it's a bit weird. But there it is. SFAX there saying, do you still have repair works next to your studio? It's not repair works, we're actually having an extension build. But yes, building is going on. Not right now. But what I found was, during most of last week's videos, not the live ones, but most of last week's video that I recorded in the studio, there was heavy machinery just outside the door, and I found that the microphone was able to tune it all out. So unless anyone's going to say, oh, I heard something, well, you must have ears like a bat then, because I heard nothing. So I was quite impressed with that. So we'll have to see what it's like when they're... So what's happened so far is they were digging out for the foundations. The concrete's now in, so they've got some work to do on Monday, and then the bricks arrive on Tuesday, then it's actual building. So we will see what it's like then, because the way I've got it set up in the studio, I do have quite a good microphone, and I have got soundproofing, even though some people don't think I do. It's like, get a proper microphone, Phil. It's a pretty good microphone. And I may not be using it in the best way, but I was impressed that it cut out all the digging noise from the excavator last week. And I've got some soundproofing in there. But it's like certain sounds will get through and certain ones won't. So we will see. We will see. But anyway, is Mad Nads busy ghostwriting books for former cabinet members? I don't know. Well, the thing is, like, Nads wrote her own book where she had all of these salacious little stories of Tory MPs' misdeeds. So I tell you what, should we put it up? Shall we just hope that they don't demonetize me for this? Because this was quite remarkable. So at the end of this article, so somewhere in the book, so it's talking... So Graham Brady obviously doesn't think much of David Cameron. And I don't know whether he just genuinely didn't think much of David Cameron's attitude, or was it, because this is where I'm saying, was it related to the fact he didn't like David Cameron's opposition to grammar schools, and because of that, just decided that he didn't like David Cameron? Who knows? But this is what he was in the Telegraph article, so will be in the book. So it says, Lord Brady, the former MP for Altrincham and Sale, near Manchester Way, who resigned from Lord Cameron's shadow cabinet in 2017, there it is, actually, over his opposition to grammar schools. So it was the shadow cabinet, accuses the former Prime Minister of an act of petulance in resigning the day after the EU referendum in 2016. Now, I would argue it wasn't an act of petulance, it was an act of self-preservation, because although he'd said if the result was for leave, he would carry on as Prime Minister, I mean, politicians do lie, let's be honest. So he wanted nothing to do with it, absolutely nothing to do with it. He was just arrogant. He just thought he would win the referendum. Anyway, he said, he argues that the behaviour of Lord Cameron and Mr Osborne, his Chancellor, was unprincipled, both in the run-up to the campaign and during it. During a series of scandals in 2014, he reveals that the old Etonian once told him, the fact is, a lot of politics is just shit. It's choosing the least bad option. That's sort of technically true. A lot of politics is that, to be fair. Admittedly, when you're a Conservative Prime Minister who's been in power for a few years, there are only bad options ever left. But, a lot of the time politics, to be fair, is choosing the least bad option. And then he says, life would be easy if colleagues paid their expenses on time and didn't snort coke and sodomise each other. So... in actual fact, the way that David Cameron's regarding the behaviour of his parliamentary colleagues is actually, you're talking about Mad Nads, is actually in line with the way Nadine Dorries has been describing their behaviour in her book. It's like Conservative MPs having one long hedonistic party. But anyway. Showing your age there. Uncle Social there. Cameron and Osborne were a worse double act than Mike and Bernie Winters and caused more damage. Oh, how many people in here will even know who Mike and Bernie Winters are? But, you know, that's incredible, isn't it? David Cameron obviously had no regard for his own MPs or their behaviour. At which point you think to yourself, so why didn't he enforce better standards of behaviour? Why, you know, I don't know. Craig there saying if there were good options, they couldn't get past the Parliamentary Tory Party. Well, no, I mean, there's always this. There is often in politics a disconnect between when they say no, you know, the least bad option. What they mean is, so you want to do, well, a normal government wants to do what they think is going to be best for the country or for whatever it is they're doing it for. But they also don't want to lose votes at the next election. It's why I always say whenever someone, you know, when you'll say if someone starts to pick on someone's appearance, like in a debate, they've lost the argument because they can't actually argue the points. So they just try to, you know, play the man rather than the ball, so to speak. They just try to pick on personality or physical characteristics because it's like, well, you've run out of arguments now, you basically won. I often think the same thing of when people attack a politician for being cowardly or not being brave enough with something, because it goes back to the old yes minister vernacular, which is, you know, absolutely true, that when you say a politician's being brave, what you actually mean is they're doing something that's going to lose them votes. And when you're accusing a politician of doing something cowardly, what you're actually accusing them of is doing something that won't cost them votes. But then you think, and you say that's an act of cowardice, but then you think, but where do these votes come from? It's the public, isn't it? So what you're actually saying, if you're accusing a politician of being cowardly, is you're actually saying you don't want them to listen to the public. And we know the public are wrong on many, many things. But nonetheless, you are saying they shouldn't listen to the public. So that's what they'll sort of mean. Sometimes you'll have a situation where it's like, well, this is what we should do, but the public won't see it that way. So it's trying to sort of balance doing the best you can do without costing you the next election. Or even too many seats, because, you know, individual MPs, I mean, I look at it as like, you know, if Labour in the next election, they don't have to win 400 odd seats. They could win like 370 seats, and that's still plenty good enough. But they're like roughly 50, not quite 50, 40 odd Labour MPs who would lose their seats as a result of that would not be happy. So you also have to try and, you know, not cost individual MPs their seats either. So it is quite messy. Phil Miller saying, do you think the Tory need to reform their leadership election process? They seem to fall into the same traps again, perhaps some kind of Labour like old electoral college or primaries. No, I actually think the Conservative system for electoral leader is far superior to the Labour one. The biggest problem with both of them is that the members get to choose at the end. But at least with the Conservative one, Conservative MPs have got quite a lot of say on which is the choice that goes. It's a bit like, so when I was voting for my Labour candidates in my own constituency, we needed a new Labour candidate, so we voted for that, and we were given a choice of three that were sort of shortlisted, and one of them was totally unsuitable, but the other two were fine, including the one who won and who is now the Labour MP. Although he wasn't my first choice, but still he's fine. He's fine. But that sort of is okay, because, you know, someone else is who sort of goes, yeah, we don't want the one who's going to crash our reputation nationally. So there's a bit of a shortlisting process. Well, the Tories do that. It would still be better if the members didn't choose, although I am in favour of members choosing their candidate from a shortlist, but not the leader. Whereas the Conservatives have more things against it. The way it works in Labour is there is a process initially with needing MPs backing. But then there's a whole mess of other things with like union backing and CLP backing and stuff like that. And it's all... And then, you know, what goes to the members is not like a top 2. It could be 4, could be 5 in theory. You can have it was 3 the last time Labour had a leadership contest. And you just do a transferable vote system. Whereas what the Conservatives do is go, no, here's your 2. And if they're strategic, they can make sure that they keep the craziest options off the ballot. Whether they'll do that, it's another matter. But they have the option. So, you know, that's how you can maybe see Robert Jenrick and James Cleverly ending up on the final ballot. But maybe not. We'll see how it goes. Pranay saying, given the loss of stride in the leadership contest, I'm more confident Badenoch will be the next Tory leader. See, we will see, and I can't read the minds of Tory MPs, but we will... I still think that a lot of Tory MPs recognise... Because they're not all... I mean, some of them are new, but a lot of them will have seen her in Parliament. She's no good. They'll have seen her in interviews. And I know how it is when there's like someone from your tribe and you're doing an interview and it doesn't look like it's going well and you actually blame others, or you go, oh, the interview was too aggressive, or that wasn't a very fair question or something. And, you know, you'll often feel they did better than they really did. But she's so awful, they really can't. They really can't. But is it? Did my seat go Labour? It did. It will be a tricky one to keep, though. He's going to have to do a pretty good job locally. Because it's a Conservative-leaning marginal now. In fact, my particular part of it is Conservative. And the local community group, according to my wife, because I don't use Facebook, but on the local community groups on Facebook, apparently they've already got the knives out for him. In fact, there's already talk of, oh, can we get rid of him? Can we have a recall petition? So apparently someone on the community group had to explain, no, you can't just ask for a recall petition. So at the moment now they're trying to work out how they can pin a crime on him. So, he's not going to keep the seat in 10 years' time unless he really builds up some cachet as a local MP. Got nothing to do with his party. But it is what it is. Oh no, people are talking about grammar schools now, my God. But, you know, it's... unsure if you've heard of a voting system called STAR. Voting STAR is acronym for SCORE. Then automatic runoff could be a better way of electing leaders. Really, honestly, the way the Conservatives do it is... The way they're doing it at the moment, maybe not. Just because it's taken a very long time for no obvious benefit. I thought at the time... Well, I'm sure it was the case. The reason why a lot of Tory MPs wanted a longer contest was to give more of a chance to the so-called moderate candidates. Because what had been happening before the election, people like Braverman and Patel even, and Badenoch and Jenrick, they'd basically already been running a leadership campaign. They'd already started that before the election, so they had a head start because they'd been promoting themselves anyway. Whereas some of the other more decent ones, who were, it's a relative term, who were actually trying to help their party do as well as they could in the election, rather than focusing on their own credentials in a future leadership contest. So they would have been left behind. So the idea was to let them catch up again. But if you think about who those people were, I mean, you're talking about Tom Tugendhat, principal amongst them. What's he done with that time? He's not making any breakthrough. And I know he doesn't really have fans in the media, so it would be harder for him to do so. But at the end of the day, you've got to be able to play the media. And he isn't. His campaign's absolutely appalling. I don't know. Other than the fact he also wants to leave the ECHR, I really don't know where he stands on anything. Do they have any moderate candidates? Yeah, relatively speaking. So James Cleverly, I know it seems weird because he's ERG, or he was ERG, but he is actually quite moderate in a lot of his sort of attitudes. I'll give you some examples. Well, first of all, he didn't ever engage in the culture wars. That's not to say he ever criticised them, and if boxed into a corner, he would push the same culture wars, but he never did it by choice. He never just came out with it. Another one when they were sort of moaning about working from home. And this is when he was foreign secretary, I think. And he said, he said of like criticising it, he's basically saying if employers want to do it, that's fine. He said, work is about what you get done, not where you do it from. So he's not the brightest of buttons, mind you. That's a lot of his problem is he's not the brightest creature. But then none of them are really going to do well because they fundamentally don't understand what's wrong with their attitude. They're focusing. I keep saying I've done like 2 videos on it this week alone because it's absolutely mind-blowing to me, although one of them was an accidental video with Mike Galsworthy. They don't know where their voters are. They think they're all the Reform UK voters. They can't win all those Reform UK voters back. And if they could, they wouldn't really get that many more MPs. There was, where was I reading it? I've forgotten now. There was some poll, I think it was YouGov, that worked out that if Reform UK hadn't done as well as they had, that the Conservatives could have won an extra 60 seats. Now, an extra 60 seats would obviously have, like, it'd be a 50% increase. So, okay, yeah, great. And it would technically not be as bad a loss as 1997, but it would still be a horrendous loss. It would still be 1997-ish type of loss. So, they're chasing after all those votes from Reform UK. If they actually manage to get them in places that are useful to them, there's no point in winning them over in seats that the Conservatives are still not going to win in. But if they can get them in useful seats to them, like an extra 60, if they win an extra 60 seats in the next, okay, that's better than 2001, because the last time they lost power, the following election, they won a net gain of 1 extra seat. So this would be a lot better than that, but it would still put them well in opposition. Matthew saying, I was surprised Jeremy Hunt never ran. He put a lot of effort to keep his seat. He did, but it was quite clear that he's no longer seen as an asset in terms of that at any rate. So Jeremy Hunt ran in 2019 and he got to the final stage. And do you know what? He didn't finish that far behind Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson, did win, I suppose, semi-comfortably. But he got a lot of votes. Jeremy Hunt did get a lot of votes amongst the members. But then when he ran in 2022, he got nowhere. Absolutely nowhere. So, and then if you think about it, in the interim, he's been Chancellor. So he's got a lot of the blame, even though ironically he's probably the most competent Chancellor the Conservatives had for the last few years. That's not necessarily to our benefit always, because what they try and do competently still isn't in our interest. But he probably was the most stable Chancellor we'd had for some time, including he was probably a better Chancellor than Rishi Sunak. And yet, he still presided over a failing economy. So the public wouldn't have a very good view of Jeremy Hunt. So it would have been absolute madness for Tory MPs to turn to him. So there would have been no point in him standing at all. And it's not like he could stand like Mel Stride and just act as a sort of different type of voice in there to create some arguments. There really would be no point. Film News is saying the moderate candidates now doing podcasts with Alistair Campbell or became Lord Clark. Well, in terms of like what's in the parliamentary party at the moment, everything is always a relative term, isn't it? Everything's relative. Moderate, of course. Usually moderate just means more in line with the public. And I would say all of the leadership candidates for the Conservatives are pretty far out of kilter with the public. In fact, there's even articles been describing them as weird, which is the word that they're using to wind up Donald Trump in America about MAGA. But comparatively, if you go down the list, Robert Jenrick is actually genuinely weird, right? Kemi Badenoch is also, I don't know with her, I think she could be a bit sly. You don't necessarily know that what she says she believes in is what she believes in, and there is an extent to which politicians can't be completely honest on that, because there you go. But she is also not in touch really with people. I mean, it may be that James Cleverly, because he had a semi-ordinary background, it wasn't quite completely, but it was, he's known ordinary living, and maybe that's part of it. But he does come across as the most normal. And then Tom Tugendhat, in some regards, is quite moderate. In some ones, he's not. Like, he's certainly not like, you wouldn't describe him as far right. But at the same time, he is wanting to leave the European Convention on Human Rights. And he does. It's not just that he's saying it. He actually said, no, there's this speech I gave years and years ago about it. And he's right as well. So he was advocating for it years ago, before Brexit even. Phil Murray say and to be honest, Phil, they had many opportunities to elect a moderate with Ken Clarke, who 3 times to become leader, so it's not like they haven't had past experience of this. Well, this is why I always say that, you give a choice of 2 candidates to the party membership, and they will almost always pick the least suitable of them. It used to be said in the Conservative Party, because you're right, Ken Clarke did run 3 times. It used to be said in the Conservative Party that MPs would reduce the list down to 2 people, and then the party members would vote for the one that wasn't Ken Clarke. But by and large, it's just that they always pick the least. And Ken Clarke's I'm not exactly a fan of Ken Clarke myself, but they do tend to pick the least suitable. I think the only time where that wasn't the case was when it was between David Cameron and David Davis. Because David Davis would have been, because he's a very lazy MP, he would have been from my point of view, they should have picked David Davis, because Gordon Brown would have stood a better chance against him. I mean, David Cameron was quite lazy, wasn't he? Am I having a bet on the winner? I've bet on... I'm not giving betting advice, by the way. I've already bet on Robert Jenrick quite a long time ago. Just not because I think, oh yeah, he's going to win. Just because the odds were decent enough that I thought, it's one of those things. You look at the odds and you think which one that's got reasonable odds has a real chance. And the way I look at it, what's probably going to happen is on the final ballot, you're going to have... Because you have to think about the balance of power in the parliamentary party. So you've got this big chunk, what we'd call the far right, the nutters, the swivel-eyed loons. And that's about, whatever it is, roughly a third of the party or something. Maybe a quarter at the moment. Then you've got like the One Nation Tories. They're sort of what we tend to call centre-right. And then you've got all the chaff in between who don't really know what's going on. And so you would imagine that you're going to get one candidate on the ballot that you would say represents fairly extreme policies, very, very right-wing and very authoritarian policies. Then you're likely to get someone else who represents like the One Nation Tories, who are the more sort of traditional laissez-faire Tories, just leave things alone and don't really rock the boat type of thing. Which probably means you're going to get one of either Kemi Badenoch. You're probably not going to get Robert Jenrick and Kemi Badenoch on there. So you'll get either Jenrick or Badenoch, and then you'll get either Cleverly or Tugendhat. And a lot of it will depend on how they perform at the conference, because that's their next big thing now. At the party conference, because there's nothing... What else is there to do at the party conference this year? What is there for them to do? They can't announce a load of policies because they ain't got a leader. It'll be quite funny if Rishi Sunak even does a leader's speech, because what would be the point? So there's nothing really to do other than to introduce these candidates to the members and let them argue their case. But I would just suggest that they'll see that Robert Jenrick is probably more credible than Kemi Badenoch. But we will see. We will see. And we also may not... it might be that party members don't rate Kemi Badenoch as much as some people may think, because there's people basing it on polls of, you know, Kemi Badenoch may well be the preferred candidate of the four at the moment, but it's like she might be the first choice for a good chunk, let's say a third of the party members, but she may be the last choice for the other 2/3, in which case whoever runs against her automatically. I'm not saying that is the case, but mathematically it could be. But there we go. I would say anyone who wants to leave the ECHR as far right includes Theresa May. I don't think you can necessarily define it by one policy. And I don't think you would describe Tom Tugendhat as far right, even though he wants that. So no, I'm not sure I would do that. Far right tends to mean not just very right wing. I mean, technically, it should just mean very right wing, right? But I think there's always an implication that it means very authoritarian, and that they intend to use that authoritarianism to promote the interests of the elites against ordinary people. And that's not all Tories. Oh, speaking of party conference, I'm at one right now, currently in my hotel room. This is the Lib Dems. The Lib Dems have got one at the moment, haven't they? In fact, you can tell when the Lib Dems have got a conference on, because then there'll be a news story about them. I was just saying earlier this week, it's absolutely disgusting. And I'm a Labour supporter, right? I think it's disgusting the way that the Liberal Democrats get virtually no mention in the news. And yeah, if I go onto the Guardian must be the most pro-Lib Dem of the papers. I don't think it's a Lib Dem supporting paper, by the way, but it gives them a fair shout. Over the years, I felt it's given them a fair call. And yet it doesn't. Like during the election, I think there was, I'm saying for definite, but I think there were hardly any articles. I seem to remember only there being one. Now someone's going to say, oh, there was actually 3 or something, but it was pathetic. And then in the interim, no stories about the Lib Dems, no stories. All of a sudden, if I go into the UK politics page for The Guardian, oh, there's Ed Davey there. Why? Because it's the Lib Dem party conference. That's it. As soon as it's over, they'll be back to ignoring them again. Ed Davey ended up jet skiing for publicity. Well, I mean, like, do you know what? As soon as he started doing that, hurling himself at large bodies of water, I thought to myself, oh, this is a bit weird, isn't it? And then I came to accept that who can blame him? Who can blame him? Because he was not being treated. The Lib Dems were not being reported on. So, and it's absolutely appalling that Reform. Now, don't get me wrong. Reform UK are pretty good at the clickbaity stuff. So you can understand why news outlets want to report on stuff that Reform UK are doing, because it's all very clickbaity. And you know, but there's also a public interest angle. Film Ready, they're saying you are right. It is the Lib Dems, and yes, sadly, you're right. We don't get a fair innings with the media. I mean, basically no one does technically, because some of them get too much emphasis and too little criticism, and some get not enough and either too much or too little criticism. And when you're not reporting on anyone, you're not getting any criticism of any kind. So, yeah, it's there's a huge problem with the way our media reports things, and it's like you can't. You know, if you were to introduce media reforms, news reforms, press reforms as well as broadcast, you can't force them to say, well, this is the thing you should be reporting on this particular day. Obviously, you can't do that. But you could at least insist that there's some sort of like quota system for different political parties and things like that according to their share of the vote. So I'd almost like, I don't know whether this would be a good idea, but maybe think about it, about having a system where you say, look, you've got this, effectively this many articles a year based on their electoral footprint, use them wisely. But they need to do something because it's utterly ridiculous. Remember, the Conservatives used to advocate replacing the Human Rights Act with the British Bill of Rights, but now we don't even hear them advocate replacement when mentioning get rid of it. Well, that is a lot of that is because Boris Johnson gave the job to Dominic Raab. He probably gave the job to Dominic Raab because you'll never believe this, unless you already know it, of course. Would you believe that Dominic Raab has something in common with Keir Starmer in that he was a human rights lawyer as well? So Boris Johnson probably thought he was an expert in human rights law, and so the ideal person to develop this so-called British Bill of Rights. Unfortunately for Boris Johnson, where his thinking seemed to fall down a little bit, is that Dominic Raab is not an expert on anything, and he's fundamentally lazy. You know, he even used to build in time in his working day as not only an MP, but a senior cabinet minister. He would insist in pissing off every morning to go to the gym. It's like, do it in your own time, mate. Imagine that. Imagine in the workplace. I'll tell you what, no, let me do it better. Let us suggest that a union, let's say Unite, just for the sake of argument, said all workers should have the right to piss off in the morning for an hour to go to the gym. The Tories would be absolutely livid. How dare you, lazy bastards, do it in your own time. And yet, the person who was supposed to be reforming human rights laws in this country did exactly that. Do you know another thing that's hilarious that's come out today? So has anyone seen the story about... there's been another little bit of nationalisation, right? Related to energy. Hold on, let me find the link I had. So basically, there's something called the National Grid Electricity System Operator, and it's now been taken off the National Grid, which is privatised, and it's been nationalised. So it's now going to be working alongside GB Energy. And what this does is it's basically the thing that makes sure that the lights stay on effectively. So it's now nationalised. So now you've got a string of Tories, including Tory MPs, who are all going, oh, this is why the pensioners, even Joy Morrissey I saw saying, this is why the pensioners can't have their fuel thing. By the way, they should, because the fuel payment story is just getting worse and worse at the moment. But anyway, this is why they can't have their fuel payment, because Labour are putting philosophy ahead of like practicality or governing, whatever the way she phrased it. And here's the hilarious thing is Labour haven't actually nationalised it. It has been nationalised and it has just happened. So technically it's happened while Labour were in government. But the process began last year. It's the Conservatives that did it. In fact, actually, the more I think about it, I think, you know, although we criticise this Conservative government that's been in place since 2010, they probably did more nationalising than the previous Labour government, now that I think about it. I don't think the previous Labour government really nationalised a lot. And there probably was no nationalisation. But the Tories have. They've nationalised a couple of train companies and they've nationalised the electricity system operator. It's just that the final process of it being brought into public hands happened with Labour in power. But it was all done and dusted by the Conservatives. In fact, I'm going to read out, I posted this on Twitter, I shall read out from the document that they published, or Ofgem published, in May 2023, last year. National Grid Context. The Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, that's a government department, Conservative government department at the time, and Ofgem aim to create an expert, impartial body with an important duty to facilitate net zero, while also maintaining a resilient and affordable system. This is intended to be achieved in part, and remember, this is a Conservative government. This is intended to be achieved in part by creating full independence of National Grid Electricity System Operator, ESO, from National Grid PLC through nationalisation. So Ofgem produced a report, a proposal in conjunction with a Conservative Party government where they actually, and they didn't nationalise it like the train companies because they were failing, and it's like, oh, it's just cheaper to bring them to public hands than to keep bailing them out. No, this was because it was deemed that there was too much of a conflict of interest. So it was an actual proper political decision in the interests of our national infrastructure. And it's very rare to find an example of the Conservatives doing something in the interests of our national infrastructure. It's not that they never tried. And when they do, it's quite funny, isn't it, that the answer is nationalisation. The answer, when it comes down to it, is always socialism. Hilarious. So I shall enjoy doing a video on that one because it's absolutely fantastic. The actual Tory MPs going mental about this. And it's like, you nationalised it. It's just so happened that it's going through now. And yes, Labour are in government. And they love it, by the way. They're incorporating it into their GB energy scheme. And they probably would have done it anyway. But the Conservatives actually did it. Hopefully they nationalise benefits, not just the losses. Well, that's always the thing, isn't it? That's always what we end up seeing when it comes to particularly the banking sector or finance sector. We privatise the profits and nationalise the losses. Do you know what Donald Trump's latest wheeze is? I thought this is hilarious. He said, in order to try, because he's now desperate to try and win votes. So he says, what I'm going to do is I'm going to abolish income tax on overtime. So Dan Needle was straight in saying, oh, so you know what's going to happen now? You're going to have all these big executives, right? All these, you know, the executives who are paid millions of dollars a year. And what they're going to do is they're going to agree a contract that pays them at the minimum wage. So it's like they'll be paid at the minimum wage. And then their overtime will be like $1 million an hour. Because that's what you would do, isn't it? You would set up contracts so that you get paid as little as legally possible for your main hours with guaranteed overtime where you're paid a massively inflated rate, and then basically no one would pay income tax. No one would pay income tax, would they? It's mad. But there we go. James there saying Thatcher's spinning in her grave. Do you know what? I would have imagined that Thatcher would have spun in her grave quite if she could, because she's buried under concrete. She can't move. We made sure that zombie Thatcher could never come back. And she's but if she were, she'd have been spinning in her grave about an awful lot of things the Conservatives have done. In fact, if zombie Thatcher did come back, she would have kicked them all in the nuts, I would imagine. Viv there saying what the Tories saying, what they do are two different things. I mean, you know, there is a lot of that in politics. Through the ages, I don't think we can blame one party. They are particularly bad at it, I always say, because unlike a lot of parties, the Conservative Party, I think they're joined now by Reform UK, they say one thing in terms of what they need to do. And even when they say it, they don't intend to do some of the things. Whereas other parties, they may find it's more difficult than they thought, or something happens, or something, you know, something unexpected, an emergency. But most political parties, when they present their manifesto, do mean it, at the very least. Past the halfway mark, can you now mention the Brady stuff from the beginning? I've already done it, but I'll do it again because it's hilarious. It was just this one. You know, where Brady says that David Cameron, because he's having a pop at David Cameron. Brady, again, like I was saying, we don't know if Brady just doesn't like Cameron. Because of it, literally, I mean, maybe Graham Brady himself is so thin-skinned that on that policy alone, on grammar schools, he just decided he wasn't going to like David Cameron for anything. But he may genuinely have just not liked David Cameron. Professionally, that is. And he says, yeah. So Cameron allegedly said during 2014, the fact is a lot of politics is just shit. It's choosing the least bad option. Life would be easier if colleagues paid their expenses on time, didn't snort coke and sodomise each other. Thought there was another story. No, that's that. I mean, I hope it's not the best bit of the whole book, because I've now ordered the book, so that means I'm not committed to reading it. I could just put it on the bookshelf. I've got plenty of books on my bookshelf I've never actually read, but you know, I intended to read it because it might be quite funny. If Labour are going to succeed with the green transition, they'll need trade deals on materials to facilitate it. Yes, correct. Could Labour be wanting something like this in their talks with the EU? So one of the, I mean, yeah, one of the things will be, I kept saying all through the last year really, the Pan-European Mediterranean Convention, that is at the very least something we should be joining, because what that does, for those who don't know, so outside of the EU's customs union, we only have tariff-free trade if because Boris Johnson kept saying, oh, it's tariff-free trade deal, tariff-free trade deal. No, it's not. It's only tariff-free if the goods we're trying to export to the EU meet rules of origin, which basically means like over half of it has to be deemed to be produced in Britain, well, the UK, or the EU, because we're trading with the EU in that regard. And it also means a load of paperwork for it. However, with the Pan-Mediterranean European Convention, if we use components or materials or something like that from from any other member of it, and this includes all of the EU, as well as some other non-EU European countries, as well as some non-EU, well, they're all non-EU, North African countries, for example. And if we use any materials or components from these countries, it classes as helping meet our rules of origin. So it's not true we have tariff-free trade with the EU. There are tariffs on some of the things we export from the EU and import into the EU because they don't all meet rules of origin. Or if they do, sometimes it's difficult to prove. This would make it easier. So because we do have a problem that we're trying to build up capacity, I mean, I'm sure you know, in terms of suitable materials for developing, like for just something simple like batteries for electric cars. You know, at the moment, there's no real capacity in Europe. Europe are trying to build it up. We're trying to build it up. So it would be a lot easier if we were to join the convention in terms of trading between different countries. The only thing that reminds of David Cameron is the story of having relations with a dead pig. Yeah, it's probably not true, by the way, but it's quite funny. I mean, you never know with Etonians. I won't bother to repeat the story if you don't actually know. I would have waited for it to go on eBay before buying the book so as not to give Brady the benefit of earning more money. I mean, you know, it's not going to do any harm with it, is he? And he's in the Lords now, so he can't do any more. I mean, there's a backbench. He's only an MP anyway. I mean, he was an influential MP in a way, but he wasn't influential on policy. I mean, he began David Cameron's leadership, period of leadership, by basically resigning from any position of influence. But there we go. I did almost think about getting it on Kindle rather than the book. I've actually gone for the book in the end, the hardback, just because I thought, you know, I'll probably be more likely to read that than on the Kindle. How big a tantrum will the Tory media make when they see the Overton window moving leftwards? Well, I mean, we've still got to see on that. I mean, they'll keep doing what they do. I mean, at the moment, they're still going on about VAT on public school fees. They're still going on about that. Obvious. I mean, if we look at let's have a look at the Telegraph. To be fair, at the moment, you could argue, and I've had this problem, there's not actually a lot of political news stories to talk about. I'll tell you how bad it is. So all of these news outlets, actually not actually all of them have a politics section, you know. I don't think the Daily Mail do on their online one, but a lot of them do. A lot of the ones that try to be serious do. But the Daily Telegraph go one step further. So they have a politics section, and then you can drop down and they've got a different section for the major parties. They've got one for Conservatives, Labour, Lib Dems, Reform UK, SNP, sorry, no Green Party, and US politics, right? So if you click on the... I did this yesterday. I assume it's still the same today. So if you click on the Conservative Party one, there are some stories in here that are actually Labour Party stories. I think, is that because there's not enough Conservative Party stories? But also, if you click on Labour, there are some stories here. Actually, there are some stories here that are nothing to do with Labour either. It's got its main story is on Carol Vorderman, and it's like, what? But there's some in here that are Conservative stories. But it is the case that there's not as many what you would call... I suppose there's as many political stories, but there's not as many like really interesting ones, if you see what I mean. So, yeah. But, you know, I mean, this is what the Telegraph are leading with. If I just go to their general politics ones. EU net zero red tape sparks fear of hard beef border with Northern Ireland. You know, cleverly, Britain has become the literal sick man of Europe again. Here's how I'd fix it. Why did we become the sick man of Europe, James, cleverly? Why did that happen? Was it anything to do with the government that was in place for the last 14 years? But anyway, when you write I don't think I'll ever be writing memoirs. I haven't got any I haven't done anything. If you want me to read it, please make it an audio book. I mean, yeah, okay. I'm not going to be pedantic and point out that you don't read an audio book, but yes, okay. I'm not going to write... I don't write anything. I'm not a writer. Technically, I write a lot every week because I write the scripts, but that's not, you know, writing a book. I don't have those skills. He can promote his book by doing a live Q&A with Mr. Beat. Mr. Beat, not Mrs. Beast. Would make my day. Well, inevitably he will, of course, won't he? He will go around the studios promoting his... That's what you do, isn't it? Promote your book. And, you know, it should be one that I think probably some people will be interested in because of secrets. Like Nadine Dorries tried to do the same thing. She tried to bring out a book, I've got secrets, I'll tell you all the secrets. But with her, you don't really know if you believe it. Because apart from anything else, she wasn't really privy to secrets other than that of being a Conservative MP. So, and also it was very obvious she had an axe to grind. Whereas Graham Brady, although he doesn't really like David Cameron, doesn't really have a particular axe to grind. So, you know, and people will sort of take it as just memoirs, just what they are. There will be, he'll spin things, he'll embellish his own role in things, he'll try and, there's always with political memoirs a little bit of, you know, opinions being thrown in there to put a particular spin or viewpoint on things. I mean, you expect that. But it, you know, it should contain a lot of quite interesting information. Whereas Nadine Dorries, even if it was like interesting, you wouldn't necessarily have gone, yeah, was it real? And I haven't read it, but some of the excerpts I read of it, I thought to myself, well, it's quite salacious what she's writing about, but, you know, did it really matter? Like, what point is she trying to make here? Johnson's memoir should be in the fiction section. Oh, absolutely. Boris Johnson's. I mean, he conducted his entire life as an extension of his own daydreams, really. But anyway. Could the green transition be something the Tories need to adopt in order to return like their grammar school thing? Yes, they will. But here's where I would have a bit of a worry about it. They did the same thing under David Cameron. They decided, in fact, there's a famous clip you can find of Tony Blair completely stitching him up over nuclear power because he was pointing out that David Cameron is both pro and anti-nuclear, for example. And even now, I mean, what's happened? The Conservatives are going, oh, the problem is Labour didn't build nuclear power and stuff like that. And it's like, well, yeah, they were setting it up. I mean, they didn't. But they were setting it up. But what happened to the Conservatives? They didn't. They had 14 years in power. And then at the end of that 14 years, we're going, oh, we should have more nuclear. Well, why didn't Labour give us more nuclear? Well, why didn't you? No, the Conservatives, it's baffling to me that they keep pretending that they weren't in power for the last 14 years. Robert Jenrick on the... I better leave this on my last point. Robert Jenrick on my in the last week with the prisoner release, the early prisoner release. He said, the solution is simple: build more prisons. Well, if it's that simple, why didn't you build more prisons then? You're in power for 14 years. But in terms of whether the Conservatives adopt it, yes, there'll come a point, assuming Labour can keep winning. Obviously, Labour have to keep focusing on winning. But if that can happen and the Conservatives don't find any easy way back to power, yes, they're going to have to elect someone who takes things seriously, and they're going to have to go, look, forget about our own ideology, this is what the voters want. But they'll lie, just like they did last time. David Cameron, oh, he was all over the green agenda. Net zero, yeah, we want loads of that. And then as soon as he came into power, what happened? Removed all the subsidies on renewable energy and gave them all to the oil companies. But there we go. Any more videos on Ukraine war? Only when there's a UK angle? Yeah, pretty much, yeah, when there's a UK angle on it. I mean, it's one of these things. It was... There's never any planned, but it's just every now and then as it relates to UK policy, I'll put it in. And often it's like, and I've said before, there are times in the past when I could have done one and didn't because there were other things. There's a bit of a hierarchy of priorities for topics. It's like Westminster is the centre of gravity of these choices. But it's just at the moment, it's a combination of things. First of all, it could be quite impactful for next year. This is assuming that it's even true because there was no formal statement. And I think even the Telegraph has suggested that no agreement was reached. Whereas it could be that agreement was reached and they're just not saying so. So we don't actually know. And we won't know unless, let's say, in 4 months' time. I mean, if a storm shadow hits an airfield in Russia, then we'll sort of guess that, yes, agreement was reached. If we're still there 6 months later and it's like, where's these storm shadows then we can probably guess it wasn't. But at the moment, there isn't actually a lot of, it is, as I said some years ago when I was building the channel up in the first place, I actually said, there will come a point where politics normalises a bit and the views will go down, which is exactly what's happened. So... But it's not just that, it's also that, the number of stories that you would think of, oh, that would be good for views. It's like there's way fewer of them. Now, I don't know whether that will change in the future or if this is what it is now or if it'll even get worse. But it does also mean that occasionally some stuff that's further away from that Westminster centre of gravity is probably more likely to end up in the schedule as well at some point. But we will see. It's all very reactive in some ways. But there we go. We'll have to leave it there. I may actually do another one of these when the book has arrived. In a couple of weeks before the book's published. And it'll probably take me a little while to read it because I'll be fitting it around other stuff. I may do another one if there's something really interesting in it. But thanks for coming on, everyone, as well. Have a great rest of evening. And until next time, I'll see you later.